Today, we're diving into a really tough but super important issue, child sexual abuse in England and Wales. We'll be looking at two reports from the National Police Chiefs Council, one from 2022 and a more recent one from 2023. Now, we know this can be, well, heavy stuff. So we're going to handle it carefully, with respect, and really focus on what the data tells us about this complex problem.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right way to go about it. Using data helps us see past all the assumptions and get a clearer picture of how big this problem really is.
And even with all of this data, we have to remember it's just a small part of the story, right?
Exactly. Think of it like an iceberg. The cases that are reported and make up the data, they're just the tip. There's a whole lot more abuse happening that we don't see.
So much going unreported.
Right. And there's so many reasons why that happens. But some groups, they're even less likely to report abuse. Like we know boys, for instance, they're less likely to report it than girls. And then you have children from minority communities, migrant groups, or children with disabilities. They often face even more barriers to coming forward.
So even when we're working with good data, it's still just a partial view. That's something we really need to keep in mind throughout this deep dive.
Absolutely.
It makes me think about all the recent talk about the ethnicity of perpetrators, especially after some high-profile cases and comments from people like, well, Elon Musk and Robert Jenrick. What can we actually learn from the ethnicity data, even with its limitations, I mean?
Yeah, it's easy to jump to conclusions based on those big cases that make the headlines, but when you look at the data, it tells a different story. The 2023 report, it shows that in cases of group-based abuse, 85% of the suspects were white. And that actually lines up pretty closely with the overall demographics of England and Wales.
Which is?
Well, the 2021 census showed that the population is 82% white.
So the idea that this is mainly a problem within a specific ethnic group, it just doesn't hold up.
No, it's not what the data shows. But there is a big catch, of course.
Yeah.
Ethnicity data, it was only available for 29% of the cases.
Oh, I see.
So that makes it hard to be totally sure about whether certain groups are overrepresented or not. But it definitely challenges the idea that this is only happening in one particular community.
It seems like we're always running up against the limits of what the data can tell us.
That's true.
But even with those limits, it's still crucial for understanding this whole issue, right?
Definitely.
Now, when a lot of people think about child sexual abuse, the first thing that comes to mind is stranger danger. But the data actually paints a completely different picture.
Oh, absolutely.
Doesn't it?
Let's break it down, shall we? We can start with what are called group-based offenses.
Uh-huh.
Now, these cases, they are horrific, but they only make up less than 5% of all the abuse that gets reported.
Really? Less than 5%?
Yeah. In 2023, there were a bit over 4,200 cases of group-based abuse recorded. In most of these cases, there were two perpetrators involved, and the abuse mainly focused on what's called contact abuse.
Contact abuse, meaning?
Things like rape and sexual assault, unfortunately.
One thing that really struck me as disturbing in the report was, well, the fact that 10% of the suspects in these group offenses are children themselves, under the age of 10 even.
Yeah, it's really hard to grasp, isn't it? And it just shows how complicated all of this is.
Huh.
But moving on from group-based offenses for a moment, let's look at the abuse that happens within families. Because sadly, this is where it's most common, and yet it's also the least reported.
That's awful. If it's so common within families, why is it so hard to report?
Well, try to imagine it from a child's perspective. The emotional struggle of coming to terms with abuse at the hands of someone they trust, someone they depend on, it's incredibly traumatic. And there are so many reasons why a child might not feel able to report it right away. According to the VSO Knowledge Portal and Partnership, or VKPP, the average delay in reporting familial abuse is a staggering 17 years.
17 years. It's heartbreaking to think about the impact that delay must have. And when it comes to the perpetrators in these family abuse cases, who are they? What does the data tell us about them?
Well, the data breaks it down like this. Friends, cousins, or siblings make up the biggest group, about 40% of the perpetrators in families. Then you have parents. That includes step-parents and foster parents, too. They make up another 30%. And the remaining 20%, they're classified as familial connections. People like, say, family friends.
So a completely opposite to what a lot of people might think. The data clearly shows that in most cases, the abuser is someone the child actually knows.
Exactly. It's not a stranger. It's someone familiar to them in 80% of all cases.
This leads us to another really difficult aspect of child sexual abuse. The fact that a large number of these cases involve children abusing other children. The data shows that over half of the reports, 52% to be precise, are cases of child-on-child abuse. What does this tell us?
This is such a sensitive area. and it's so important to understand it in the context of development. The data shows that in these cases, both the victim and the perpetrator are most often 14 years old. And it's important to make a distinction here between consensual acts, which, even though they're illegal because of the age of consent, are different from more serious offenses.
That makes sense. What are some of the most common serious offenses we see in these child-on-child cases?
The top three are sexual assault, rape, and then the creation and sharing of indecent images. And in these cases, the police, they operate with what they call a common sense approach.
A common sense approach. What does that actually mean?
Well, it means that they look at each case on its own, taking all the specific details into account. And their main focus is always safeguarding all the children involved. They recognize that not every instance of child-on-child sexual activity needs a really harsh legal response.
It's a tough balance, isn't it? Recognizing the complexities of how adolescents develop while also making sure vulnerable children are protected.
It really is. Talking about complexities, another striking pattern we see in the data is this significant gender divide when it comes to who's committing the abuse.
Oh yeah, definitely. The numbers are pretty shocking. 82% of the perpetrators are men. That's almost 5 times the number of women.
And the gap gets even bigger when we look specifically at contact offenses.
Right.
In those cases, 9 out of every 10 perpetrators are male. But when we look at offenses related to indecent images of children, the numbers are a bit more balanced.
Why is that? Why are the numbers more even when it comes to indecent images?
Well, we have to remember that creating or sending an indecent image of yourself, it's still considered an offense if you're under 18. So that contributes to a higher number of female perpetrators in that category.
That makes sense. And it's also important to note that the victims are overwhelmingly female, too. 79% overall, 78% in group-based offenses, and even in online offenses, they make up 68% of the victims.
That's right. And this brings us to a pretty worrying trend that we're seeing in the data. We're seeing this really sharp rise in the total number of cases being reported. Back in 2013, there were about 20,000 cases. But by 2023, that number had jumped to almost 115,500.
Wow, those numbers that's a huge increase. What's going on? What could be causing such a dramatic rise?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's complicated. Some of it is probably due to better reporting. The police are doing a better job and there's more awareness of the issue overall. But it's hard to say for sure how much of that increase is just because of better reporting.
So better reporting might be part of it, but it doesn't explain the whole picture.
Exactly. And when you break down the types of abuse being reported, you see some pretty concerning trends.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to online offenses.
Online offenses?
Yeah. So in 2022, for example, almost a third of the cases were related to stuff happening online.
What does that look like? Online offenses?
Well, 27% of those online cases involved sharing indecent images, and another 5% were about online grooming. So that leaves the remaining 70% as what we call contact offenses.
So even with the rise in online stuff, most of the cases still involve some kind of physical contact.
That's right. In 2022, there were over 20,000 cases of rape reported, then 27,000 cases of sexual assault, and 20,000 cases of sexual activity with a child. And speaking of online abuse, we're also seeing perpetrators using all these new technologies, things like AI and deepfakes.
Deepfakes to create indecent images of children.
Yeah, unfortunately.
That's pretty scary to think about.
It is. It means we have to get smarter about online safety. And we need to educate both kids and adults about these new threats.
For sure. We've covered a lot of ground here today. Looking at all this data, all this information, what would you say is the most important takeaway for our listener?
That's a good question. I think the most crucial point is that child sexual abuse, it's way more common than many people realize. It's happening in families, among friends, and online, like we just talked about. That old idea of stranger danger, it's just not accurate. We have to understand that the people who are most likely to harm children, they're often the people they know and trust.
It's a tough pill to swallow, but it's the truth, isn't it? Like you said earlier, data helps us see past our assumptions and really face reality.
Exactly. And understanding the problem, that's the first step to finding solutions. This data can help us come up with ways to prevent abuse, it can help law enforcement focus their resources, and it can ultimately make things safer for children.
Speaking of facing reality, I came across something in a separate report by the National Crime Agency. It said they estimate that as many as 830,000 adults in the UK pose some level of sexual risk to children. That's 1.6% of the adult population, or 1 in 62 people.
Wow, yeah. That number it's hard to wrap your head around. But it just shows how important it is to be vigilant, to be aware, and to understand that we all have a responsibility to protect children. This isn't just a problem for the police to solve. We need a change in how we think about this issue, how we prevent it, and how we support victims.
So, what can we do as individuals? I mean, where do we even begin to make a difference?
One of the most powerful things we can do is just talk about it. Break the silence. The more we talk about child sexual abuse, the more we understand the risks, the warning signs, and what kind of support is out there.
You're right. We need to educate ourselves, have open conversations, and empower kids to speak up if something's wrong.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture where children feel safe to come forward, where they know they'll be listened to and believed.
This has been a difficult conversation, but an incredibly important one. Thank you so much for helping us understand this complex issue and for breaking down all this data.
My pleasure. Knowledge is power. And by understanding the problem, we can start to make real positive changes.
To our listeners, we know this has been a lot to take in. It's heavy stuff, but facing the reality of child sexual abuse is the first step towards preventing it and protecting children.
And remember, there are resources available if you need support, or if you want to learn more about keeping children safe. We'll make sure to include links to those resources in the show notes.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with something to think about. We've looked at the statistics, the trends, all the complexities, but what does this all mean for you? What can you do in your own life to create a safer world for children?
It's a question worth pondering. Even small actions, when enough people take them, they can make a real difference.
That's a good thought to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It really is. It's about all of us working together. That's what's going to lead to real change and make a difference for kids.
Couldn't agree more. Well, this has been, as we said, a tough conversation, but it's so important to have these conversations. So thank you again for being here and sharing your expertise. It's been really insightful.
Thanks for having me.
And to everyone listening, we know this wasn't easy to hear, but understanding this issue, it's the first step. It's the first step towards, protecting children. So thank you for listening and for caring enough to learn more about this.